Welcome. I'm Bill Solis, the founder of Prophecy Depot Ministries, and today I'm going to be presenting to you about the prophetic Mideast wars. We're going to pin up America and Israel versus Russia and Iran, dealing primarily with Psalm 83 and all the peripheral prophecies that surround Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. Now, many of you might be familiar with the fact that Israel, Russia, and Iran are certainly in these prophecies, and in Ezekiel 38 anyways. But what about America? Are we going to find America anywhere in prophecy dealing with these particular Mideast wars? I'm going to tell you that I believe we can find America, and I'll show you where and how we get there. So Psalm 83, for those of you not familiar with it, deals with an Arab-Israeli conflict, a concluding Arab-Israeli conflict written about 3,000 years ago. That you see a map up here. It's an inner circle of countries that surround Israel. They share common borders with Israel. They're the Arab states around Israel and the terrorist populations within them. We'll talk about that prophecy, and we'll compare it to another prophecy in Ezekiel 38. You'll notice that same circle, the inner circle of the Psalm 83 countries there. But you look outside, there's an outer ring of countries that are not in Psalm 83. They're in Ezekiel 38. Now, these countries have never been Israel's notorious enemies throughout time, but they will come together as an enemy of Israel. And they're predominantly Muslim, as is Psalm 83. Apart from Russia, we're going to find in Ezekiel 38 is a multi-faith country. But these are predominantly Muslim-related wars. I bring that up because that's important, because I'm going to show you at the end of the presentation that Allah is going to lose his Akbar as a result of these wars, his greatness. They say Allahu Akbar, the terrorist, when he blows himself up. Allah is the greater God. Well, we're going to find out that that's not the case, especially as a result of these wars. Now, before I get going, I want to invite you to come to our newsstand, prophecyheadlines.com. It's an award-winning newsstand, and every day we put together current events that are going on, and we look at the newspaper and examine it through the current events through the prophetic lens. prophecyheadlines.com. So where are we at on God's prophetic timeline? We find ourselves between two key, marquee prophetic events. One was the rebirth of the nation of Israel, fulfilled in May 14th, 1948. It fulfilled many biblical prophecies. It is important because God had to put Israel in position for what we're going to see he's going to do in the next marquee event called the Gog and Magog invasion of Ezekiel 38. We are in between that. We're 72 years closer now to the Magog invasion, but it hasn't happened yet. But why is it so important? It's because God is going to use that event to let the world know he's the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here's what we find out in Ezekiel 39:7. So I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. Then the nation shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. So there was a time when God knew God's name was known. He didn't need to make it known through Israel, his people, anymore. But he knew 2,600 years ago that time would fade, and he would have to make his holy name known again. He's going to choose this marquee event to accomplish that. He knew we would come to a time where we are right now, where people were bowing down 5 times a day to the wrong god in Mecca, and Hindus would be doing meditation to all kinds of pagan gods, etc. But he's going to set the record straight in this particular prophecy. That's why it's a key marquee event that we'll be talking about. So we're going to go to Ezekiel 38 first, verses 1 through 6, just to talk about the coalition put together. It's commonly called the Gog of Magog coalition, the Magog invaders. We find them on another map. I showed you the one about the outer ring earlier, by their historical names, Meshech, Tubal, Magog, Rosh, etc. We see the general consensus on the left of the slide as to who these countries are. Most of the prophecy guys would tell you Russia spearheads this. You've got Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Now this prophecy, many of us are concerned, is stage setting and will happen very, very soon. We already see that the leaders of these countries in this video that I'm going to play here for you have come together with Iran and Turkey and Russia on numerous occasions, and they have met to strengthen their ties, but also to deal with the post-aftermath of the Syrian revolution and protect their sovereign interests therein. We know that Russia has been given Iran the S-300 missile defense system. They're building 2 more nuclear reactors inside of the Bushehr area of Iran. Turkey is going to have a nuclear facility in by 2023 or 24 that Russia's putting together as well. So their ties are extremely well put together and developing. But now normally at this point, what most teachers would do is go right into the next verses, Ezekiel 38, 7 through 12. But we're going to take a fast forward and detour and jump ahead to Ezekiel 38, verse 13, and we're going to look at all the participants in addition to those Magog invaders that happen in Ezekiel 38. We find out that there's going to be 15 participants in the prophecy, not just the Gog and Magog invaders. You have God the victor. You have Israel, the intended victim that's going to be invaded. You have the invaders, which we showed, Magog, Rosh, Meshech, Tubal. You see them on the list there on the slide. But we also have 4 more populations, rounding out the field of 15. We have Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and their young lions. We're going to take a look at those guys, group number 4 there, those protesters that seem to be standing on the sidelines. We're told in Ezekiel 38:13, this is where they show up. Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take a plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry gold, to take away great plunder? So this is where we find out the actual motive of Russia. They're coming to Israel. They're going to invade it to take plunder and great booty. It pictures in Israel in a very prosperous condition. Israel is en route for that at this point in time. But there will come a point in time where that's their motive. They're going to take their invaders and they're going to come from the uttermost parts of the north and they're going to invade Israel for plunder and booty. But who are these guys and why are they standing on the sidelines? Well, we find out that by looking at old maps that Sheba would represent Yemen, more than likely. Dedan would represent northern Saudi Arabia and perhaps some of the Gulf states. But who are the young lions of Tarshish, the merchants of Tarshish and their young lions? Well, we'll take a look at that right now because I think this is where we might find the UK and the USA. Matter of fact, I've written an article, and this is also taken from my Now Prophecies book, called Are the UK and the USA in Ezekiel 38. You can Google that article and you can read it. So the young lions of Tarshish. Now there are a couple theories as to who Tarshish is, the merchants of Tarshish. And their young lions would, of course, be the colonies that were offshoots from whoever the merchants of Tarshish are. Now, one of the thoughts is that Tarshish is Spain. And the colonies that came out from the loins of Spain would, of course, have been your Latino countries, your Central and South American countries. This is based upon the thought that Tartessus was the being spoken of here as Tarshish. And in the Greek mythical writings, this is where this shows up. And it's undefined, really, as to whether this is a city, a river, a nation, or whatever the case may be. There's really no archaeological evidence that pinpoints what Tartessus really was. And when you read all the arguments from people who put forward Spain, which I've looked at quite a few of them, you find that argument starts to fall short pretty quickly. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that argument. I'm going to go to the argument that I think is more predominant, and that is that it's dealing with the UK as the merchants of Tarshish, and out from the UK, they had the colonies. You remember, there was a time when the sun never used to set on the British Empire. Well, you had Australia, and then, of course, you had the North American countries of Canada and America, etc. So regardless of where they are, the theme here is about the merchants of Tarshish, not the athletes, the entertainers, the politicians. It's dealing with people who have commercial interests involved in Israel at the time that are concerned that those interests are going to be adversely affected by the invasion of Russia, who's coming after plunder and booty. But we're going to spend some time on Tarshish and identifying them. We're going to look at this from a biblical, historical, archaeological, and geopolitical perspective. And I think you'll agree with me when it's all said and done that there's a high degree of likelihood that the merchants of Tarshish represent the UK and the young lions represent at least America. So who is Tarshish? We're told in Genesis 10, verses 4 through 5, the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families in their nations. And we find out that the mention of Tarshish in association with isles shows up 5 times. You see the other verses there, Psalm 72, Isaiah 23, 60, and Isaiah 66. Now, the British Isles are a group of islands in the North Atlantic. There are islands of Great Britain and Ireland and the Isle of Man and the Hebrides. And there's over 6,000 smaller isles, and about 210 of them are inhabited. So we have islands there. We don't really have islands with Spain. So the British Isles, Great Britain, etc. So where is Tarshish? On a location, we have a clue here because Jonah when he was given the commission to go to Nineveh and talk about the impending judgment that was coming, he decided to go in a different direction. And you see a map up there. It says in Jonah, it talks about Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish, and he paid the fare thereof and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish. So he went there. So you see the map there. He went down to Joppa, and he boarded a ship, and he sailed as far west as he could go. If he went down to Joppa to get away from Nineveh, which you see he should have gone northeast from where he was, he would have taken a camel if he was going to the south, down in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or he would have gone, to the west in the Jordan area, the ancient time called Edom. No, he boarded a ship, and he went as far away to the west as he could. Of course, he never made it. You know the story about he got swallowed by the whale, etc. I'm bringing it up to make a point that he boarded a ship to go as far away in the opposite direction, toward the direction of Tarshish. Now, we also have a clue as to where that is. In Psalm 48, verse 7, it says, Thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. So what we have here is the ships of Tarshish are coming from the west. They can be broken or stalled with an eastern wind. Now, not a western wind, an eastern wind, because a western wind would facilitate the speed of the ship getting to its destination. So we see that it's far, far west. Here's another map to look at here. Some archaeologists believe Tarshish, ancient name is of Britain, is Britain. Britain is Tarshish. It is noted that it is beyond Gibraltar. You see the map up here, the Strait of Gibraltar, which separates it's the end of the Mediterranean Sea far to the west. It separates the bottom of Spain to the north of Morocco, and that's the Strait of Gibraltar. Then you come up around and you find yourself getting up into what I believe is Tarshish, up into the British Isles up there on the map. But what is Tarshish? What was it known for? Tarshish, we're told in Ezekiel 27, verse 12, they were merchants with riches. This shows up 7 different times. This particular one that I've highlighted here says, Tarshish was thy Tyre, speaking of Lebanon, merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, with silver, iron, tin, and lead. They traded in thy fairs. So we find, I want you to note, they had iron and tin and lead, and these were part of their riches. They were merchants. They were customers of Tyre. They went from wherever Tarshish is, probably the British Isles, all the way across to the Mediterranean to get these goods to Tarshish. Well, that would require ships, very seaworthy, strong ships. Well, we find out that they had them. And 9 times the ships of Tarshish are mentioned. Here's one in Ezekiel 27, verse 25. The ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market, and thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the midst of the seas. Now, Tarshish gained renown for these extremely sturdy ships. They were very seaworthy vessels. They could take extended voyages to transport their exports and imports across the Atlantic Ocean and through to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, I write this in my Now Prophecies book about the goods, the tin, etc. About 586 BC, Ezekiel acknowledged that tin was among the primary metals that came from Tarshish. Cornwall, a county on England's rugged southwestern tip, was the only major source of tin in Europe for the past 2,500 years. Not Spain, per se. It is also true that the mountains of Wales, just north of Cornwall, had been a source of all the minerals and metals listed above in Ezekiel 27:12, listed in that prior slide. Here's another more recent discovery. Came out of the Heidelberg University, an article in September of 2019 called The Enigma of Bronze Age Tin. Here's what it says in some summaries. They examined Bronze Age tin from the 2nd millennium BC from Israel, Turkey, and Greece. Their findings was the tin artifacts from Israel, for example, largely matched tin from Cornwall and Devon in Great Britain. So we have a reason to believe that the merchants of Tarshish, which had seaworthy ships that came to a customer of Tyre, they actually came brought that from Great Britain. Now, we found out that once upon a time, the empire on which the sun never set was the British Empire. At one point, by 1922, they had 458 million people that they were sovereign over, 1/5 of the world's population. They had about 13 million square miles that they were sovereign over, which is about 1/4 of the earth. And you can see a map there that you've got North America and you've got Australia down there. Now, this is interesting. At World War I, when Britain was fighting with France, take out the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire, the German nation, they put this ad out. Here's an actual ad back from World War I. It says that World War I, they're looking for young lions in Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand to enlist with the old lion to fight in World War I. So interesting that I think that dovetails in. And you're saying, well, where's America? If you're saying, Bill, if you're saying America's got to be the young lions. Well, remember, this is how this starts. In 1707, the union between England and Scotland made Great Britain. It made it the dominant colonial power in North America. Now, America, in 1776, almost 70 years later, got its independence from Britain. But they were sovereign over us at that point in time prior to that. So we've looked at the archaeological, historical, and the biblical. Let's look at the geopolitical perspective. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire, who had reigned over the Middle East from 1517 to 1917, was defeated. And so at that point in time, France and Britain decided to split up sovereignty over the Middle East. And we see that France had control over Syria, but the Tarshish, or the UK, had control over areas like ancient Palestine, parts of Jordan, it was called Transjordan back there, over Iraq, etc. So we see that France and Britain were involved in the more modern aspects of what's going on in the Middle East. And out from there, they allotted their states. You got Afghanistan, you see Egypt in 1922, Saudi Arabia in 1932. They started relinquishing control, Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. You see the dates here, 1946 with Syria and Jordan. But then came Israel in 1948, and the UK was supposed to give Israel its state in 1917 at this time with the Balfour Declaration, but not until 1948 did it become a nation. But the question is, where's Spain now when we look at this geopolitically? You just don't see them in modern times dealing with what's going on in the Middle East. Now, because the UK, I submit to you, because UK did not do what it was supposed to do, it had the blessings of victory in World War I, and that prepared the land of Israel for the Jews to come, but they didn't. The UK did not make Israel a nation. That was part of the Balfour Declaration. And we see that over the next 70 years, the UK, the sun now always sets on the British Empire. It relinquished so much of its holdings from 1920, when the sun never used to set on the British Empire. By today, Great Britain UK controls approximately 94,000 square miles, and it has about 66 million people that they're sovereign over. So you see the big downward slide there. But as they were sliding downward and the sun began to set on the British Empire, who rose to the occasion? It was America, the great superpower, probably the greatest superpower that ever existed. Now, we have been involved in the Middle East, not Spain. And as young lions, we have been involved in helping broker together peace treaties. You see the one with Egypt, between Israel and Egypt, Camp David in 1979. Jimmy Carter was instrumental in that. We see Bill Clinton was instrumental in the treaty with Jordan in 1994 between Israel and Jordan. Again, not Spain, but us in America. So another reason why I submit to you that I believe America is involved here as the young lions of Tarshish. Now, you're going to find that these peace treaties are very fragile, and they won't be lasting much longer as I go through more of this presentation. One last thing on this. J.R. Church wrote a book called The Guardians of the Grail, and I quote from it on page 220. An inscription discovered in 1780 on a cliff above Mount Hope Bay in Bristol, Rhode Island, contained an engraving that read, "Voyagers from Tarshish, this stone proclaims." It's believed to be inscribed around 533 BC. Harvard University has found 5 locations within the United States where the merchants of Tarshish had colonies. So these are my arguments for the reason why I believe America could be found in biblical prophecy. That's the good news. But the bad news is, what do we look like in biblical prophecy? We look like we're protesters on the sidelines, not coming to Israel's rescue. Matter of fact, the Ezekiel 38 invasion is stopped by God himself, and I'll show you how that happens a couple slides down in the presentation. But Israel's IDF does not stop them, nor American troops. Matter of fact, America seems to be on the sidelines. So what's the issue? How can America go from a superpower to just a sideline protester in probably a short span of time? Because Ezekiel 38 is probably coming around the corner relatively quickly, folks. We see the signs showing themselves. Could it be economic collapse? Some people have speculated that America starts to be compromised from its superpower status to an economic collapse. Presently, we have a debt of $23 trillion, and that's definitely a bad situation. And we're dealing with this COVID virus that's been going on right now. We don't know the outcome of that as we speak. We're already printing up more and more money, trillions more, that will go into our national debt. What about an external nuclear attack? We know that there are powers that don't like us, that have nuclear weapons, China and Russia, etc. What about perhaps a nuclear electromagnetic pulse? This is of great concern with the Department of Homeland Security. If you launch one of these nuclear weapons up about 250 miles burst altitude in the air, it spreads out like at the speed of light, like a canopy, and fries all the electronics underneath it. That would set us way back as a nation should something like that happen. What about internal terrorist attacks? We've already seen devastation with September 11th. Made things change for us in America. What about what's going on where terrorists could actually infect major populations with viruses? They're already seeing this being effective right now. What's going on is America has gone on lockdown for the most part with COVID-19. What about the rapture of the church? What if you took out all the Bible-believing, true-believing Christians in America? But what are you left with? Pro-abortion people, pro-homosexual people. These are antithetical to what the Bible teaches. So this could also be a judgment upon this country per se where it gets compromised. Now we're going to rewind back because I skipped forward to verse 13. We're going to go back, and I'm going to tell you why I don't particularly think, as we look at Ezekiel 38, 7 through 12, that as close as the Ezekiel 38 invasion is to finding fulfillment, why I don't personally think it's ready to find fulfillment. Because for it to find fulfillment, to happen at the present time, every precondition has to be met. And there are still some preconditions that are relatively significant. Explain to us how Israel must look before Ezekiel 38 and 39 can find fulfillment. They must be regathered from the nations in the latter years, brought back from the sword, likely representing persecution, into Israel, which had long been desolate. Now we're going to give check marks there because that has definitely been going on and has happened and is still ongoing. But there's some more to this as we get through these verses. They've got to be a peaceful people, living in a land of unwalled villages, dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates, having an abundance of silver and gold and acquired livestock and goods, possessing booty and great plunder, because that is what Russia is enticed to come after. So they have to be dwelling without walls. Let's start right there. Is Israel dwelling without walls? These are literal walls. They have no bars nor gates. It says in Ezekiel 38:11, they'll go up against the unwalled villages. They must dwell safely without walls, bars, nor gates. Well, you see a picture right there. They have a 400-plus mile partition wall, at some points as high as 20 feet, filled with concrete, separating Israel from Palestinian terror, and it's been working. But that is a major wall inside. There's security checkpoints and gates throughout Israel as well, trying to protect Israel from the Palestinians. We're going to talk a little bit more about the walls because I think we need to look at this very literally. Matter of fact, Ezekiel 38, there's nothing about this prophecy that shouldn't be looked at literally. We really don't need to allegorize any detail within Ezekiel 38. It's very specific. It's one of the most specific biblical prophecies in the Bible. So here's an article that came out in September of 2018. A 30-foot tall border wall goes up. The IDF says Hezbollah, Lebanese army are colluding. In other words, this is a wall. I'll read it to you. The Israeli military this week publicly unveiled its 11-kilometer long, 9-meter tall concrete border wall along the Lebanese border. The concrete barrier is designed to serve two main functions: protect Israel's civilians and soldiers from sniper attacks and prevent infiltration into Israel by Hezbollah operatives. Well, that's why people in the old days used to build walls, to protect against infiltration. This is a 7-mile estimate, about 29 feet high. Began work in early of 2018. Matter of fact, they've been uncovered tunnels that Hezbollah had dug under to get into Israel from the north in Lebanon. Why were they digging tunnels? Because they had walls in front of them. It's better to go under them than over them. That's just one wall. There's another wall in Lebanon. These are a few headlines about walls. Israel completes Lebanon border wall from Metula. This is in the Times of Israel in 2012. That's a separate wall between Israel and the Lebanon border. And we find out in the Times of Israel in May of 2018, Israel starts building a sea barrier to defend against the Gaza attacks, even trying to defend themselves outwardly into the Mediterranean. Palestinian protesters breach Israel's Gaza border fence. So you got those fences there between the Palestinians. 3 injured, 3 killed, hundreds injured. This was in the LA Times in April 2018. Israel starts building a massive fence on the southern border with Jordan. So we talked about northern border with Lebanon. Now we're talking about the partition wall inside of Israel proper, talking about protecting against the Gaza. We also got their concerns about Jordan as well. So they've got a border wall going there. That was in 2016. So that's the walls. But Israel must also be dwelling securely. And the Hebrew words used in Ezekiel 38:8 and 38:11 are Yeshav V'Thak. And the precedent, biblical precedent for dwelling securely is they don't dwell securely because of some politically brokered peace deal. They dwell securely because their military has defeated their enemies and enabled them now to dwell securely and tear down walls. So when will Israel dwell securely? How will that come about? Because they have enemies all around them. Well, we're told by Ezekiel exactly when that's going to happen, 10 chapters earlier. He uses the same words, Yeshav V'Thak, 2 times. And here's what he says in verses 24 through 26. Thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and hallowed them in the sight of the Gentiles, we just said that's already happening in Ezekiel 38, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. And they will dwell safely, Yeshav V'Thak. They'll build houses and plant vineyards, just they will dwell securely, Yeshav V'Thak. But when? When I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God. Now, why would he have to execute judgments on those around them who despise them so that they could dwell securely? It's because they aren't allowing them to dwell securely. And who are those around them that he's referring to? Well, they happen to be the Arab enemies around them that have come to war against them. They've hated them since from time immemorial. They have an ancient hatred that's now under the umbrella of Islam. And you've got these Arab countries around them, with the terrorist populations within them. They happen to actually be part of Psalm 83, so we'll get there shortly. But let's conclude Ezekiel 38, this marquee event, this powerful event. As we get into Ezekiel 38, verses 19 through 23, we find out how God plans on stopping this, and it is a supernatural defeat. And there's a purpose for that. There's going to be a great earthquake. Every man's sword is going to be against his brother. That earthquake is going to cause panic among the troops, the different coalition of invaders. They're coming from the uttermost parts of the north. There'll be pestilence and bloodshed and flooding rain and great hailstones and fire and brimstone. And by the time the viewer on CNN is watching this all happen, there's going to be no doubt in their mind that this was not a normal military defeat. This is going to be supernatural. And that's when God will be able to say with no problem, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, which required the Jews to be alive. Hitler couldn't kill them all. They had to be alive because he's going to make his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel, the covenant people of the Abrahamic covenant. And I will not let them profane my holy name any more than the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. So it required the Jews to be in Israel and the land of Israel to be under Israeli sovereignty. And that will be the case, and God will, at that point, stop this most massive, armed, and dangerous Mideast invasion of all time. And folks, I do believe that's coming in the very near future. As a church, we may be here for it because I believe it's a pre-tribulation event, but we may not also be here, and I'll show you why I believe it's a pre-tribulation event. We could be raptured prior. So then it goes on to say, in the aftermath of that supernatural victory, we look at Ezekiel 39, verses 9 through 16, the Israelis will burn the weapons of the invaders for 7 years. They'll convert them into fuel. It appears to be what he's talking about. This is why some of us believe that 7-year clue, that this prophecy could actually happen before the tribulation, and here's why. When you look at the 7-year tribulation period, it's split quite often into 2 halves, the first half and the second half. In the first half, we find Israel. They've confirmed a covenant. The Antichrist has confirmed a covenant. And they're living and enjoying a pseudo-peace. They believe that they're okay, they're secure, and they could easily be burning weapons for 3.5 years, converting them to fuel, and they likely will be. But then at the mid part of the tribulation, the Antichrist goes in and abominates the temple, and Jesus even says in Matthew 24, when you see that happen, he's speaking to the Jews, flee, especially those in Judea, flee to the mountains, because at that point the Antichrist is going to come out and try to commit genocide of the Jews. We find in Zechariah 13:8 that he successfully kills 2/3 of the Jews in the land. It would be a very worse genocidal attempt than Hitler even put together. But the point being, in the second half of the 3.5 years, they're not likely going to be stopping to burn weapons. Christ instructed them to flee, not to burn weapons. If anything, they'll be picking them up and using them to defend themselves, would be my contention. So they could easily burn weapons for 3.5 years prior to the start of the tribulation, and 3.5 years into the start of the tribulation, but not likely be burning them into the second half. Then it goes on to say that there'll be a burial ground that doesn't exist just yet in a valley of Hamanah, a place called Hamon-Gog. It doesn't exist yet, but it will exist when it needs to exist, because Israel is going to use this area to bury the dead. And it says that this place will be east of some sea. It'll instruct travelers, passersby. It'll be a valley east of some sea. So we have to think, well, where could this be? The primary candidates, you got the Mediterranean Sea, but that would pretty much put this massive burial ground with probably contaminated soldiers inside of Israel proper, Israel today proper. Not likely. It could be east of the Sea of Galilee, but that's really not a lot of valleys, and that's mainly under Syrian control at this point in time, etc. The Red Sea would be a long way to export all these bodies, not likely, but there is the Dead Sea. And there's a lot of valleys, perfect place to bury the dead, and the valleys over in ancient Moab and central Jordan there. And you say, well, Israel doesn't have possession of that area. How would they do that? Well, I'm going to show you that they will soon have possession of that area as that fragile peace treaty with Jordan gets broken and Jordan gets defeated in a war by the Israeli Defense Forces. They will also be burying the dead for 7 months. And it says when they're doing that, the world will actually give them renown. They will become famous. They'll gain world renown. So the Israel of today is going to gain world renown in the near future as a result of the supernatural victory of God and their behavior in the aftermath as they burn weapons, convert fuel, bury the dead. They gain world renown. So 2 marquee events. We're smack dab, not necessarily in the middle, but we're 72 years forward from the rebirth of the nation of Israel, heading toward, you see the question mark, 2000 and what, because we don't know exactly when the Gog and Magog invasion is going to happen. But there's a question mark there. What happens? How do we get from where we are right now in 2020 to wherever we're going to get when Gog and Magog, when Israel will be dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates? Well, let's start taking a look at that piece by piece. Now, I'm going to show you how I believe chronologically things are going to happen. Starting very soon. I call these now prophecies. They could happen at the present time. They lack preconditions. We're going to first turn our attention toward Iran and an ancient prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49 called Elam. Now, Iran was definitely in Ezekiel 38, but Iran actually has double trouble in the latter years. They're the subject of dual end times prophecies. Ezekiel spoke about Persia, but Jeremiah, his contemporary, spoke about Elam. So we have double trouble for Iran. We talked about Ezekiel 38. That does not pan out good for Iran. They're defeated supernaturally with their cohorts. But let's look at Elam for a minute, because I don't believe this is the same prophecy. And in my Now Prophecies book, I have a book called Nuclear Showdown, where I put the reasons why Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49 are not the same prophecy. Now, Jeremiah actually wrote before Ezekiel did. Jeremiah wrote this prophecy around 596 BC. Ezekiel probably wrote Ezekiel 38 around 10 to 15 years later. So the first mention of Iran in biblical prophecy of the end times, and it is the latter days prophecy, I'll show you that, was mentioned by Jeremiah. And it was a different prophecy than Ezekiel 38. Now, back to this other slide for a moment. I want to tell you that Elam, you see, is that shaded area there, and I've got the red arrow pointed toward a nuclear reactor there. It's called the Bushehr nuclear reactor. And this is a 40-year-old facility that was started by the Germans after the revolution in 1979. They left. The Iranians tried to piece it together with different parts and technology, and they couldn't finish it, so they brought Russia in the 1990s. So you have actually it's a 40-year-old facility with a 30-year-old cooling system with different parts on it, different aspects of construction. No one fit there really to handle a major disaster, like a huge earthquake, like happened in Fukushima. So it's a nuclear disaster waiting to happen, and it sits where 3 tectonic plates merge. It sits right on top of them, and Iran is very seismic. Matter of fact, in April of 2013, they had a 6.8 right there at the Bushehr area, killed 37 people, and shortly thereafter, 6 days later, they had a 7.7 down toward the border of Iran and Afghanistan, just to give you an example. Now, trying to give you an idea geopolitically of what we got going here, because this is a very seismic and dangerous place right there in Elam. Persia is on the other side of these mountain ranges there called the Zagros Mountains, but Elam is just about one quarter of modern-day Iran that you see on this map. And Russia is now building 2 more reactors in Bushehr, Bushehr 2 and Bushehr 3. Bushehr 2 is expected to be done in 2024, and Bushehr 3 is expected to be done in 2026. So depending on when this prophecy happens, you may actually have 3 nuclear reactors or more in this seismic volatile area across from the Persian Gulf. So my concern is, as we talk about this prophecy, it does appear to be a nuclear Iran involved in a nuclear prophecy. Now, Donald Trump stepped away from the JCPOA treaty. Since then, Iran has been enriching uranium and doing all kinds of bad things, and they sent and attacked the Aramco oil company in Saudi Arabia, and we found out that actually came from the Elam area, that attack. And Trump said as a result, he's locked and loaded. He tweeted this on September of 2019. And it says, and then the Sun came out with an article shortly thereafter and says, Donald Trump draws up plans for military strike on Iran as Tehran vows to shoot down U.S. planes as war fears grow. Now I want to notice this map of the strategic targets that Donald Trump has supposedly got. And look, target number 8 is a Bashar nuclear reactor. Now if that thing goes up in a war, in a strike or an earthquake, you would have a nuclear disaster that would spread. Studies have been done, it could spread within 15 hours across the Gulf and can kill 40 to 100% of the populations in the Gulf Cooperative Council states. I've written about this in my book called The Nuclear Showdown in Iran, Revealing the Ancient Prophecy of Elam. And instead of reading the whole prophecy to you, I'm going to summarize it, but I'm going to play my book trailer for you, which tells you a little bit about where I'm going with this presentation at this point.
By far the most important thing today, not only today, but in a historical perspective, the most important thing is to make sure that a militant regime, a militant Islamic regime or a militant Islamic movement does not get its hands on the weapons of mass destruction.
Missiles cloud Mideast skies over the Persian Gulf. Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz. Arab oil is choked off to world markets. Hezbollah and Hamas launch scores of missiles into Israel. Terror cells initiate cycles of violence in America. About 2,600 years ago, the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel issued parallel end times prophecies concerning modern-day Iran. Today, the rogue country is becoming a nuclear nation and aggressively advancing its hegemony throughout the greater Middle East. Nuclear Showdown in Iran, Revealing the Ancient Prophecy of Elam, is a non-fiction thriller taking the reader on a journey of discovery through the eyes of the prophets and the minds of today's key national players. But there's a backstory, an even bigger story. It's a spiritual showdown in Iran between Islam and Christianity.
Iran is being transformed into a Christian nation in this generation. Iran has the fastest growing evangelical population in the world. Iranians are experiencing miracles, healings, visions, and dreams. And with the help of satellite television, millions of them are coming to Christ. 2 years ago, Iranian government began cracking down on Christianity. But it's not working. Christianity is growing in Iran. Iran is in the Bible prophecy, and many Iranian Christians are excited about what the Bible says about the future of Iran. Please pray for your brothers and sisters in Iran.
That was Hormuz Shariat, the founder of Iran Alive Ministries. And as I conclude, I'm going to tell you why, as he said, many Iranians are excited about what the Bible has to say about their future. Iran is experiencing a massive conversion from Islam, a lot of the people to Christianity. It's the fastest growing evangelical population in the world. So that's exciting, and we need to pray for them, as Hormuz has asked us to do. So we're going to summarize the Elam prophecy. It's a disaster that's brought about by the fierce anger of the Lord. One thing you notice about end times prophecies, when God starts to execute his vengeance and fury, he's angry, and he puts his anger forward. And in this case, he brings about a disaster, I believe it's nuclear, in Iran, because they have fiercely angered him. And why have they fiercely angered them? And I believe it's this leadership that's alive today that has fiercely angered him. Because he's going to destroy the kings and the princes there. There's something wrong with the leadership. We've got bad leadership. Why are they bad? Well, they want to launch something lethal somewhere. And the Lord is going to prevent that from happening, because he's going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might. Now, if you take a bow away from an bowman, he can't launch he may have a quiver full of arrows, but he can't send those. And in this case, we're talking about missiles. If you take away the launching capabilities, you can't launch missiles. And Iran has high-tech missiles. A lot of them are aimed at Israel. And they're working on a nuclear program. So at the foremost of their might, they're going to be stopped. Now remember, we're dealing with geographically located in Elam, where those Bashar nuclear reactors are. He's going to break the bow at the foremost of their might, likely referring to the chief place of their might, their nuclear scenario. This is why I think it gets nuclear, because as a result of the disaster, the Lord says he will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven and scatter the indigenous population, the Elamites, the affected Iranians, towards all those winds. It says there will be no nations, plural, where the outcasts of Elam will not go. This is a worldwide dispersion, which is necessitated by this disaster that is caused by the Lord in his fierce anger. And he says, it goes on to say that Elam, this will be such a bad situation, that Elam will be dismayed before their enemies and before those who seek their life. Now, this means Iran has to have a menu of enemies. And Iran has a menu of enemies presently. Israel is concerned about them. The global community is concerned about them, shutting off the Strait of Hormuz, preventing world oil from getting there, the threat that they've done. So that's why they tried to broker a peace deal with them, the JCPOA. And also the Gulf Cooperative Council states across the Gulf are very concerned about Iran continuing to spread its hegemony against them. I'll show you that in just a minute. He says he's going to send the sword after them until I have consumed them, until the Lord has consumed them. The sword typically represents, biblically in type, a military invasion. So I rule out the possibility this will be an earthquake, although an earthquake could happen prior or at the same time. But I do believe we've got enemies. They're going to come against Iran. We're not told specifically which enemies, but I would put on the top of the list Israel and America. And then he says, this is where Homer's Chariot said the Iranians are excited. He said, I'm going to set my throne in Elam. And that's very interesting. That's the same Hebrew words in Isaiah 66 and Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah chapter 3 says the throne of the Lord will be in Jerusalem in the Messianic kingdom. Isaiah 66 says heaven is God's throne. So what is up with that? I write about that in the Nuclear Showdown book, the possible options of what's being said there. But even in line with that, it concludes in verse 39 of Ezekiel 49, verses 39. And in the latter days, which is why we call this the latter days prophecy, it's the same words used in Ezekiel 38 when it talks about the latter days. So we have two latter day prophecies dealing with Iran. He says, I will bring back the captives of Elam. Some translations, I will restore their fortunes. So the population, the indigenous population that flees into the worldwide dispersion will ultimately someday be brought back in the Messianic kingdom. Iran will have a remnant into their ancient homeland of Elam, and they will be restored their fortunes. But the bottom line is they will have to go out into the nations of the world and go through the tribulation period. And if they survive, they have to become believers in the process. And those are the remnant he's talking about that would be brought back. So we encourage, Hormoz Chariot and I, and even Pastor Tom Hughes has been on Hormoz's TV show, we encourage the Iranians to know Jesus now. Don't use this as an exit strategy to get out of Iran and think you'll get to know Jesus later. You want to know him now before the Elam prophecy and before the rapture of the church. So you don't have to go through the tribulation period. So the enemies of Iran, yes, they have some. I talked about them briefly. One of the big concerns is the Gulf Cooperative Council across the Gulf. They're concerned about Iran continuing to spread its hegemony, especially if they tip the balance of power with a nuclear weapon. Currently, they've got control over Lebanon with Hezbollah, Syria with Damascus with Bashar al-Assad, Shia militias in Iraq now. Yemen, of course, they got the Houthis down there, the Gaza as well. Here's another map to look at. This is Iran and its proxies. You see that they've got Israel surrounded. Of course, the Gulf Cooperative Council states, including Saudi Arabia, are concerned because those are Sunni Muslims, Iran, and their proxies are predominantly Shiite, except the Hamas, but they're still a proxy of Iran. And they've got Israel surrounded. Now that's important because it's interesting. I wrote an article recently about why are the proxies of Iran is in Ezekiel 38, but why aren't its proxies not in there? I mean, if Iran's going to be going into Ezekiel 38, you think they'd bring their team with them. But it turns out they're not anywhere to be found. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria is not found in Ezekiel 38, the Hamas, the Houthis down in the Yemen area. What happens to them? Why are they not involved? As a matter of fact, the invaders of Gog and Magog had to storm through Lebanon over Hezbollah's territory to even get into Israel because they're invading from the uttermost parts of the north. What happens to them? Well, we're going to take a look at some of these proxies and what happens to them, in my estimation. Let's start with Syria. Syria is the subject of a couple of different prophecies. We're going to look at a couple of different angles, camera angles on this prophecy. We'll start with Isaiah 17, and then we'll look at Jeremiah 49, verses 23 through 27, predominantly dealing with the destruction of Damascus, but also other strong cities inside of Syria. These prophecies are not just limited to the city of Damascus. So we'll start with Isaiah 17. Many people are teaching that this is something we could be watching for and should be watching for soon, and I concur with them. It says, Isaiah 17:1, that Damascus gets destroyed. As a burden against Damascus, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. It'll be reduced to rubble. It will never exist again, is literally what's being said in the Hebrew there. It exists today. It's in shambles after the Syrian Revolution, but you'll see that that is not the fulfillment of this prophecy as I go through the next verse. We find out it's the IDF that is responsible, not the Free Syrian Army. We're told in verse 9, in that day his strong cities, referring to Damascus, referring to Syria, more than just Damascus, strong cities, plural, will be as a forsaken bough and an uppermost branch, which they left because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. So we find out that the Israeli Defense Forces have caused desolation, not only in Damascus, but in other strong cities in that country. And here's the real-time application, folks. It happens overnight. We go down to the end of Isaiah 17. We're told then, behold, at eventide trouble, and before the morning he, speaking of Damascus, and the masculine pronoun, is no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us, and the lot of those who rob us, which points out that this is destruction is done as a matter of self-defense. They're being plundered and robbed by their enemies, and God has foreign policy in Genesis chapter 12, verses 3, that he will curse those who curse Israel. Curse Abraham extrapolates on through to the Jewish people in Israel. So let's shift the camera angle and let's go over to Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 23 through 27, because I think we get some more important details as to how Israel is going to take out this city and the other strong cities. It says, against Damascus, Hamath, Arpad, and Arpad are shamed, for they have heard bad news. They are faint-hearted. There is trouble on the sea, a clue right there, and it cannot be quieted. It cannot be quiet. So we're talking about not only Damascus, he throws in Hamath and Arpad. These are strong cities. If you look at them on a map today, that would be Aleppo, which was the number 1 populated city in Syria, and Homs, the number 3. Now these cities, of course, have been ravished quite a bit with the Syrian Revolution that's been going on. But these are the cities more than likely on modern-day map he's referring to, in addition to Damascus, which is the number 2 populated city. And there's trouble on the sea. Well, what sea could he be alluding to if we take this literally and don't allegorize it? And there's no reason to allegorize this prophecy either. He's talking about the Mediterranean Sea, where it turns out Israel has 5 nuclear-equipped Dolphin-class submarines in the Mediterranean Sea presently. Matter of fact, here's an article in May of 2019. Israel is an underwater nuclear power thanks to the German submarines. These Dolphin-class submarines have been imported from Germany. So is that what he's talking about? Something coming from the sea that causes the Syrians to be faint-hearted in other cities, not just Damascus, and it can't be stopped, it can't be quieted? Then he goes on to say something very interesting. It says, Damascus has grown feeble, she turns to flee, and fear has seized her, anguish and sorrows have taken her like a woman in labor. Well, of course, if Israel's going to launch a nuclear weapon from the sea, or something like that, if that's what's being said there, I'm not saying that's what they're going to do, that would cause that kind of reaction of fear like a woman in labor. But then God asks this rhetorical question through Jeremiah. Why is the city of praise not deserted, the city of my joy? So this trouble is coming on Damascus and other strong cities, but he interrupts this prophecy by this rhetorical question. And of course, that's interesting. Why is the city of Jerusalem, the city of God's praise, not destroyed? Damascus is going down. It's going to be reduced to rubble overnight. It's going to be a ruinous heap, but Jerusalem is still going to be intact. The place that they're robbing and plundering. Very interesting. He's throwing it back in their face. Why you're trying to destroy Jerusalem, but look what happens to you. Curse for curse and kind. God's foreign policy. And he goes on to say, therefore her young men, speaking about Damascus and those strong cities, shall fall in her streets, That would be civilian casualties. And all the men of war shall be cut off in that day, says the Lord of hosts. That would be military casualties. Very descriptive information here. And he goes on to say, I will kindle a fire in the wall of Damascus, and it shall consume the palaces of Ben-Hadad. Those would be the government buildings and things like that, more than likely. So that's Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah chapter 49. Now, when a lot of people teach the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah 17, they often neglect to look at some of the other verses that actually show that Israel takes a severe hit when this happens. I believe that's what's being said. We're going to take some time to look at that, because I don't believe Israel goes unscathed during this invasion. And it's a devastating war. So we look at Isaiah 17, verses 4 through 6. The glory of Jacob, Israel will fade. Now in that day, we're speaking in that day, this is going on with Damascus. The glory of Jacob will fade, verse 4. And the fatness of his flesh will become lean. That's not a good imagery. It will be like even like the reaper gathering standing grain, yet gleanings will be left in it like the shaking of an olive tree. 2 or 3 olives on the topmost bough, 4 or 5 branches on the fruitful tree. Now, that's not a good imagery in any of that I just read to you. We're going to take a look at the olive tree as the example that Isaiah puts forward. The olive tree is a tree that's found all over Israel, so it's a great example for Isaiah to use. It can grow up to 50 feet tall. It's a large tree that could have upward of 500,000 olives, and it's in the small fruited variety. Now we're talking about a shaking that's going to take place in this day with Damascus. And we're going to find that there's only a few, 2 or 3 olives on the uppermost bough, and 4 or 5 on its fruitful branches. So what happened to the other 500,000 that usually is on that tree? So let's take a map of Israel and let's look at that verse a little more closely and unpack it. Let's put an olive tree, and the uppermost bough would represent northern Israel in this typology. There's a shaking in the olive tree, and only 2 or 3 olives are left at the uppermost bough. So what I believe was going to happen, and probably as a result of the Elam prophecy, because Iran, when it gets attacked in the Elam, is probably going to call in its proxies to come after Israel. They're not going to go it alone, more than likely. Why would they? Why should they? And look at them surrounded by those proxies of Iran. You got Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq. I'm not sure if the Houthis will be involved, but Hamas will definitely be involved. There's going to be a shaking, in my estimation, when this happens, and precipitating Israel having to make a statement and take out Damascus and strong cities and just blow them away. But Israel, in my estimation, is going to take a hit. Let's look at the severity of what could come against them during this Damascus brawl. Here's a headline from the Press TV, May 13, 2019. Gaza matches Hezbollah can fire 1,000 missiles a day into Israel, meaning Hezbollah can also fire 1,000 missiles into Israel a day. Now, Hezbollah's missiles are precision-guided. Jerusalem Post, August 2019. Hezbollah has enough precision-guided missiles for a confrontation. They have a bank of targets they could hit anywhere in Israel with pinpoint accuracy. And Syria, on the other hand, has got chemical weapons still. Look at the headline below, the national NPR, February of 2019. More than 300 chemical attacks were launched during the Syrian civil war, the study says. Now, do you think if Iran called its proxies to lob 1,000 missiles a day from Gaza and 1,000 missiles from the north, which they can, and Syria gets involved with chemicals, the Iron Dome won't be able to stop all that. Their missile defense systems won't be able to stop that. There'll be a shaking, a serious shaking, and it'll precipitate Israel's need to destroy their enemies, take out their major cities. So I'm concerned that may be where this is going. And then, what does that leave the Arab states around Israel that just sees a major Syrian and major Arab city go taken down by Israel, probably nuclear? And I don't want to get into how they could do that without contaminating the whole area, but they can. There's tactical nukes they can use. Don't you think that Lebanon's going to be concerned that Beirut might be next? Why would Israel stop there? Why not take out Amman, Jordan? Why not take out Cairo? Why not take out Mecca? And why wait? Because Israel's hurt now. They've gone through this bath with Iran and their proxies, this bout. Why not come together now and try to take Israel out for one final attack against Israel? I believe that might lead to Psalm 83. And we're going to talk about Psalm 83 in just a minute, but I think that the concern is legitimate. Why would Israel not take out other cities? Well, if they do come against Israel again in a concerted effort as a coalition of Psalm 83, Israel's definitely going to take out another city, and I'll tell you the prophecy on that, and that's Amman, Jordan. So we're going to look at the toppling of Jordan for a minute. I told you that peace treaty they have with Jordan is paper thin. Well, here's why in my estimation. We're going to look at Jeremiah 49 and Zephaniah 2 briefly. The toppling of Jordan. Jeremiah 49 says, now remember, Amman, Jordan is about a 2-hour drive from Damascus. It'd be like driving from Los Angeles to San Diego. It's not that far away. And here's what we're told here in Jeremiah 49, verse 2. Now, you won't see in these prophecies I'm going to read that peace treaty anywhere. This is all about war, that peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will cause to be heard an alarm of war in Rabbah of the Ammonites. That would best represent Amman, Jordan, the capital of Jordan and northern Jordan. And look what happens. It shall be a desolate mound, and her villages shall be burned with fire. Sounds very similar to what's going to happen to Damascus. Then Israel shall take possession of its inheritance, says the Lord. Now, why would Israel take possession of its inheritance unless Israel was the victor? You know, so they're gonna fight also there, wage war and win, and Jordan is going to be toppled. Now, remember, I told you they're going to take their possession. I'm going to show you another prophecy. I told you that I believe the valley of Hamongog is in Jordan. Well, if Israel starts taking possession of Jordan, that gives them sovereignty over Jordan. Remember, that's where Jesus told the Jews to flee when the abomination of desolation happens in Matthew 24. Flee to the mountains. And many of us would teach they're fleeing to the mountains of southern Jordan and Petra. Why would he do that why would he advise that unless Israel had sovereignty over that area by the midpoint of the tribulation when the abomination of desolation happens? Well, in my estimation, they will. Now, these prophecies I'm reading to you have not happened yet. Check the history books. Zephaniah 2, dealing with Moab and Ammon as well. Moab would be central Jordan, historically, and Ammon would be northern Jordan. I have heard the reproach of Moab and the insults of the people of Ammon, which they have reproached my people and made arrogant threats against their borders. He's referring to my people, the Jews. He's heard their arrogant threats against their borders. And here's what's going to happen. The residue of my people shall plunder them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them. The Israeli Defense Forces are going to take them out, and the Jews are going to annex more territory. Now, they do this when they win wars. Joshua did it 3,300 years ago. King David and King Solomon did it about 3,000 years ago. Israel did it in 1967 when they won the 1967 war. It makes them more secure. It makes their borders more defensible. And this apparently is what's going to happen. And they're going to move into Jordan. And they're not going to be stopped by it. Now, there's an interesting thing there because Jordan has control over the Temple Mount through the Waqf Society. This was a colossal mistake Israel did in 1967. They gave control of the Temple Mount to Jordan, and there's this gold dome there. Now, I believe that gold dome at this point in time can be gone, and here's one way that might happen. Now, I'm not saying Israel is going to bomb it away, but they will not have the problems if they've taken out their Arab enemies around them to do that. We're going to shift our attention to Psalm 83 as I start to wind down now. I won't spend a lot of time on it because many of you are familiar with my teaching on this topic, but Psalm 83, we talked about that inner circle of countries. It was written by Asaph, a psalmist, a worship leader for King David. He wrote 12 psalms. And we find in 2 Chronicles 29:30, moreover, King Hezekiah and the leaders commanded the Levites to sing praise to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer. Shozah, the Hebrew word for prophet. Behold their vision. Also, we find out 1 Chronicles 25:2, the sons of Asaph were under the direction of Asaph who prophesied according to the order of the king. Now, I bring that up because there are many of my colleagues who suggest that Psalm 83 is not a prophecy, that there's no prophecies in the psalm. But I would tell you that Asaph was a prophet, and Psalm 83 is his most prophetic of all the psalms he wrote, in addition to Psalm 50. So here's just briefly, we're going to read just a few verses, and I'll explain it to you because this is how I believe this finds real-time application. Your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more, for they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. So what we have here, in a brief summary, is a confederacy, a contemporary confederacy. This is not a chronological ordering of Israel's enemies, which you'll see were many more than what we're going to see in this confederacy. They come together with a crafty plan, a devious plan, as a confederacy to destroy the nation of Israel, that the name of Israel will be banished from the history books, it will be remembered no more. And then we're going to take a second just to look at who he refers to in the vernacular of his time, because remember there was no Jordanians or Palestinians back then. And he's got the tents of Edom listed first. That makes them sort of the star of the show, their plight. In a habitation condition, they're listed in tents, which typically represent refugee conditions. And the Ishmaelites, Moab we talked about in Jordan, Hagarenes, Gebal, Ammon, etc. And it says the Syrians joined with them and helped the children of Lot. The children of Lot would be modern-day Jordan, Ammon and Moab. So I'm telling you who they are, and here's their plan. And one of the reasons they want to wipe Israel off the map. They come together, they want to take for themselves the pastures of God for possession. They want the promised land for their possession. So let's take a look at this. Here's their names on an ancient map, their historical names. You notice I've got the tents of Edom highlighted. They're sort of the star of the show. Here's a modern-day map. So these countries who have a hatred of Israel, they come together against Israel, the Arab states, in 1948, and they lose that war. And the tents of Edom become a reality in my estimation. That's when you had the refugee crisis, the Palestinian refugees now living in tents. The Arabs told the Arab states told those Arabs that were living in Palestine at the time, it was called Palestine, becomes Israel in 1948, to get out. Well, they got out, but they can't return now that the Palestinian refugees living in tent-like conditions. These refugee camps are all throughout the Middle East, not just in the Gaza and the West Bank area. So that's who they are today. They're armed and dangerous with all their friends, modern-day equivalents. So in a summary of this prophecy, you see their motive, their goal is they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. On the right, you see the list of the belligerents, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, Jordan, etc. And if it were to happen today, they don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. They want to take for themselves the nation, the pastures of God, and they want to call it Palestine for the tents of Edom and put the Palestinian flag over it. Now, we're going to talk about the city of God's praise, Jerusalem, for just a minute, because this is going to climax in this cup of trembling, drunkenness, or dizziness in some translations, of Jerusalem in Zechariah 12, verse 2. It says, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling and dizziness to all the people round about, specifically, geographically, the neighborhood. When they lay siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. Now, they've been laying siege over the wars throughout time. They want control over Jerusalem. But I believe this is going to climax in a final siege of Judah and Jerusalem, at which point it will be more than just a cup of trembling and drunkenness, which has sort of been throughout the modern-day Middle East. But I think it's going to climax in this. And here's how God is going to respond to this, because the Israeli Defense Forces exist in Bible prophecy. They're not just an application today, they're actually foretold to come for necessary purposes. So here's how God's going to stop what's going to happen when Jerusalem becomes under siege, a cup of trembling. Zechariah 12:6 says, in that day, when it's a cup of drunkenness, I will make the governors, the captains or chieftains, you could look at that, the Hebrew word is eluf, which is actually the term for a lieutenant commander in the Israeli Defense Forces today. I will make the eluf, the IDF of Judah, like a fire pan in the woodpile. So he's laying out what the battlefield will look like. And like a fiery torch in the sheaves. And they shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left, but Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in her own place. So in other words, the imagery is this: the fiery torch, the IDF. The Arab countries around them like sheaves. Sheaves are kindling for a fiery torch. The picture is not good for the Arab states around them. And we have to ask ourselves, he's going to devour them on the right hand and on the left hand in the neighborhood, in the region. And does Israel have enemies around them that despise them and need judgments executed upon them so that they can dwell safely on the right hand and on the left hand? And yes, they do. And they're not part of Ezekiel 38. They are part of Psalm 83, coincidentally. Quickly, as we talk about the Israeli Defense Forces, they were predicted. Ezekiel 37:10 tells us when this valley of dry bone vision he had, when we see a picture of Israel in the Holocaust, in my estimation, Ezekiel prophesies, and God says to tell them in Ezekiel 37:10, so I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. So they're going through the Holocaust. They're refugees, but they're going to come on their feet. They're going to come into the land of Israel. we're told in the next verse that this happens at a time when they say, as the Jewish people throughout the nations of the world, our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and we ourselves are cut off. And that's what they were saying, and that's how they felt at the end of the Holocaust. But God is saying he's going to bring you back into the land, and you're not only going to be able to walk on the land, you're going to be able to fight and defend the land. And the Israeli Defense Forces today, this is one of the places they're mentioned. Zechariah 12:6 was another one. The prognosis for the Palestinians, the kindling, that the sheaves that will be devoured by the fiery torch. Obadiah 1:18 says, the house of Jacob shall be a fiery torch, and Joseph a flame. That's also the IDF. But the house of Esau, that represents the Edomites, the Palestinians, the tents of Edom, shall be stubble, and no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. The plight of the Palestinians will come to a bitter end. Now, not all Palestinians are Edomite descent, so not every Palestinian is going to be devoured and destroyed necessarily. But a definite contingency of ethnicity within the Palestinians today have Edomite descent. So I told you at the beginning, which was probably hours ago, thanks for bearing with me all this time, that Allah is going to lose his Akbar. He's going to lose his greatness because Psalm 83, the Arab states around Israel, are all Muslim. Ezekiel 38, predominantly Muslim. Out of the 9 populations, 8 of them are Muslim, apart from Russia, the multi-faith country. So I believe after Psalm 83 happens, that Islam will take a punch to the gut of Islam. It'll start to compromise it. There'll be 600 to 800 million people in these prophecies, Arabs, that are adversely affected at the core of where Islam is in the Middle East, that are going to be either imprisoned or exiled or killed as a result of these wars. This is going to be a punch to the gut of Islam. Ezekiel 38, which I believe follows pretty quickly on the heels of Psalm 83, will be an uppercut to the jawbone of Islam, so that I believe by the time we come to the tribulation period, Islam is knocked down for the 10 count on the canvas as a result of these wars, and therefore I do not see Islam being vibrant in the tribulation. I don't see a Muslim Antichrist or a harlot world religion based out of Mecca, which some people try to teach. My personal view is that's not going to be the case as a result of this, partially as a result of these two things. So just to show you that Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38, as I summarize, are 2 different prophecies. Some people have suggested they could actually be the same. Psalm 83 is dealing with Arabs versus Jews. Ezekiel 38 is predominantly dealing with non-Arabs versus Jews. They have different enemies. They have different inner circle, outer ring. The different motives is Psalm 83, they want to take the land, the pastures of God. Ezekiel 38, they want plunder and booty. Different defeats. The Israeli Defense Forces protect the nation in Psalm 83, but the Lord stops it supernaturally in Ezekiel 38. The results in the end analysis is the ancient hatred of the Arabs of the Jews is over in Psalm 83, and God makes his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel, in the land of Israel, in Ezekiel 38. You can get more information on this in my book, in Psalm 83, The Missing Prophecy Revealed, and DVD. Now, I've told you about Hormuz Shariat. The good news in Iran, and we'll conclude with this. God is going to set up his throne in Elam in Jeremiah 49, verse 38, and in the latter days, Jeremiah 49, verse 39, bring back those captives from Elam. This has got Hormuz Shariat, whose mission statement of Iran Alive Ministries is transforming Iran into a Christian nation in this generation. This is why. They're excited about this aspect of the Elam prophecy. Miracles, healings, and visions are going on in Iran right now. I'm going to play you 2 videos with Hormuz that tell you this, and it will encourage you. All these things are about to happen, but remember, in the midst of it all, God is doing great things, supernatural evangelism, and Iran is one of the places.
Let me tell you this story. This man called me on the air, on the live program, and he was saying, he said, 3 months ago I had liver problem, and I called you, and you prayed for me, and I got healed. And I was saying, praise the Lord, praise the Lord. And he was not excited. He had such a monotone voice. And then I prayed for others. I prayed for somebody with tumor. He got healed. One of my relatives had cancer. I prayed, and she got healed from her cancer. And here I was saying, oh, praise the Lord, praise the Lord. After 3-4 minutes of this, he got frustrated with me. He stopped. He said, Pastor Hormuz, why are you so excited? Have you read your Bible? This is normal. It must happen. I mean, he had no emotions. And here I was so excited. For him, it was normal. For those people, it is normal that Jesus does miracles. Even in Quran, they look at Jesus as a miracle worker.
So Jesus is still in the miracle business, and it's proof going on in Iran and elsewhere. And Hormoz Shariat is a testament to that. I'm going to show you one very important miracle right now in my last video of the presentation.
Hopelessness and despair. These are the words that best describe the current situation in Iran. As a result, Iran has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Hi, my name is Hormoz Shariat, and I'm the president of Iran Alive Ministries. What you're about to see is an actual story that happened here during a broadcast at Iran Alive. This is a story of a life transformed by the power of the gospel. Watch this, and I will see you after the video.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم الحمد لله رب العالمین الرحمن الرحیم مالک یوم الدین ایاک نعبد و ایاک نستعین
و حتی مثلا از سن 4-5 سالگی شروع کردم نماز رو یاد گرفتن و مثلا قبل از اینکه وارد مدرسه بشم سوره های قرآن رو حفظ میکردم. دین هستن، اینا خیلی شستشون مغزی ما رو میکردن و اگرم یه همچین چیزی میشنیدم خوشحال میشدم، ولی همیشه به ما میگفتن حتی اگر یه مسیحی رو بکشیم وارد بهشت میشیم و برای همین بیشتر تلاش میکردم که قانونهای مذهب رو دقیق‌تر انجام بدم. فکر میکردم وضوء اشتباه گرفتم، دوباره هی میرفتم وضوء میگرفتم، شاید این مثلا برای یه نماز 10 بار تکرار میشد که من میرفتم وضوء میگرفتم و برمیگشتم. و مریضی روحی هم که گرفتم، افسرده وحشتناکم بودم. احساس کردم که هیچ وقت به خدا نرسیدم و مامانم تو حالت مرگ بود. خیلی هم وابسته بودم به مامانم و گفتم که من خودم رو میکشم اگه اجازه ندید تو خونه این کار رو بکنم، بیرون از خونه خودکشی.
تو جوونی، تو آینده داری مامان جان.
و گفتم باشه اگر دوست داری با هم خودکشی کنیم.
My brothers and sisters, I'm with you tonight. The Lord has a special message for you tonight. If you're hopeless, if you're oppressed, if you're planning to commit suicide, the Lord says stop. He has a hope and a future for you. If you're planning to kill yourself, stop and call me.
و برای نیم ساعت با کیشون با صحبت کرد. کاری که کردم انجام میدم و اگر تو بخوای پشیمون بشی من خودم تنها این کار میکنم. وقتی که رفتم توی اتاق دیدم مامانم داره دعای توبه رو میکنه و خیلی عصبانی شدم.
به من ندیا، نه
چایش میکنم.
نمیخوام باش حرف بزنم، ولم کن، نمیخوام، قطع کن بینم.
چی داره خدا فردی
نمیخوام،
لجبازی نکن.
قطع کن، خجالت بکش. هرمز مگه کیه؟ ولم کن، کشیش هرمز کیه؟
ولی شما گفتین اگه کسی
الو.
When I talked to her, she was cold,
بله من
she
پروینا
was
هستم.
fighting, and she told me very proudly, I'm going to kill myself, and your Jesus cannot do anything for me. After about an hour of argument with her, and I couldn't change her mind.
عیسی من به تو ایمان میارم.
You said it yourself. Allah has done nothing for you. Give Jesus just one chance. You can always kill yourself next week.
وقتی که این فکر اومد توی سرم گفتم این بهترین راهه که یه بار دیگه تا آخرین لحظه مرگم به الله خدمت کنم.
She was thinking, okay, I'll pray, and next week, this time, Jesus had not done anything for me. I call live on the air and I tell everybody, look, I tried Jesus for a week and nothing has changed, and I'm going to kill myself tonight, and I will do it on the air.
و بعد از یک هفته که خودکشی میکنم حداقلش اینه که وقتی به حضور خدا میرم میگم آخرین کارم من برای تو انجام دادم. فردا صبحش که از خواب بیدار شدم، ساعت نیمه شب بود که از خواب بیدار شدم، دیدم که مامانم خیلی راحت داره تو خونه راه میره و دیگه اونطوری نیست که تعادل نداشته باشه یا دستش رو جایی بگیره. گفتم ما باید سریع بریم بیمارستان و وقتی که جوابو سریع گرفتیم دکتر گفتش که فقط میتونم بگم یه معجزه شده، چون هیچ اثری از بیماری MS نیست.
چجوری میشه؟ شما خودتون گفتین که ایشون ترمینال
فقط
بودش
میمونه. خانم یه معجزه است و به یه امام دعا کردین. شما کجا نشون دادین؟ خانم این شبیه یک معجزه است. این یک معجزه است.
ما اصلا به هیچ امامی دعا نکردیم، به عیسی مسیح دعا کردیم.
So how's that for a true story? God is still in the miracle business. I submit you these are the latter days spoken of in Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49. And the prophetic time clock is racing toward the marquee event where God is going to show who he is. He's going to uphold his holy name to his people Israel in the land of Israel. But you don't have to wait for that event to happen. I spoke at a Bible study one time, and the guy came up to the host, one of the attendants came to the host the next day and said, you know, he was talking about Damascus being destroyed. I'll believe that when it happens, when I see it happen. You know, you don't want to wait for these things to happen because we're on a photo finish here. The rapture is going to happen at any given time, folks. You don't want to stick around to hedge your bet. You want to get to know the holy name of God right now. And with that, I'll conclude. May the Lord bless you and keep you in these troubling times, because God is always great, and he loves you very much.